Hello, this is the Gemsbach, and today's topic is Terraria, a game developed by Relogic and originally released in 2011. Any players of Terraria will know that difficulty levels in the game do not merely affect the stats of enemies. A softcore character will only drop held money on death. A medium core character will drop held and worn items on death. A hardcore character, when it dies, just stays dead. Terraria possesses an overabundance of difficulty-related terminology, so just to be absolutely clear, I'm not talking about normal mode versus expert mode, and I'm not talking about the hard mode that triggers in a world when the boss, known as the Wall of Flesh, is defeated. The distinctions among softcore, medium core, and hardcore are pretty dramatic differences in consequences for each character's demise, and as a result, the majority of new players likely choose softcore mode. Those looking to prove what they've learned, on the other hand, are likely to crank it up to hardcore immediately. My personal opinion is that both are subpar options when seeking the best playthrough of the game, when playing alone and starting with a new character in a new world. Here is my caveat to this difficulty advice. If you're really just playing Terraria as an artist or an architect, that is, you just like building things, then softcore obviously makes the most sense. But if you want the most enjoyable possible RPG adventure experience, then I highly recommend medium core. Here's why. My first playthrough of Terraria, back in early 2013, ended just before I would have attempted to fight the Wall of Flesh. I wasn't completely bored, per se, but I yearned for that feeling of starting the game for the first time, when the world felt big and new and threatening, and I could build a base wherever and however I wanted. So I started a new character in a new world. But after a few hours, I resented how much ground I was going to have to retread to catch up with my initial character. Suddenly, I was no longer invested in either character, and I stepped away from the game, thinking that I would return shortly. In fact, I did not pick Terraria up again until after the 1.3 update, over 2 years later. For a first playthrough, Terraria is a very long game. It was a long game when I was trying to play it originally, and it's comparable to the duration of a Witcher title now, even if you spend basically none of your time on recon, exploring, building, or organization, and instead just move from seeking one boss or piece of equipment to the next. The game can still take dozens of hours for a first-time player to beat. In all of that time, most players are likely to start seeing death as irrelevant at some point. After all, if you're playing on softcore, there is very little reason to not use suicide as a convenient fast travel to your base. But this is a psychological disaster for an RPG-style game. This completely trivializes all of the threat and intrigue that the world can hold. You might think you'll never get bored. You might not get bored. But then again, you might. But pick medium core and you introduce just a bit of consequence back into the equation. The psychological problem is totally fixed. If there is no fear of failure, there is no satisfaction in success. A 100-hour, easy-as-pie sequence of fetch quests is no fun. But a brutal struggle against a horde of vicious beasts for conquest, survival, and the fate of your world is a whole bundle of fun. If you keep the beasts vicious, you keep the quest epic. Okay, so it keeps things exciting. But that still doesn't explain why I'm not telling you to skip straight to hardcore. After all, if a little threat is good, isn't a lot of threat better? Well, often, yes. But there are actually 2 reasons that I think medium core is a more enjoyable choice. Terraria's randomness, and recovery runs. I'll cover the first one now, and the second one in the next section. So, when I say randomness, I am talking about world generation and enemy spawning, either of which can put you in an awkward or even impossible situation occasionally. And yes, there are precise rules governing how many enemies can spawn in a certain area at a certain time. And if you have made a biome mob grinder, you are well aware of this. But that doesn't change the fact that a Medusa that spawns a screen away from you can petrify you over a chasm. That doesn't change the fact that a naturally occurring minecart track can terminate in a lake of lava. That doesn't change the fact that you can get cornered in a tower in hell by monsters that spawned above you after you entered. You get the picture. At some point in 50 or even 100 hours of playing, the odds are extremely good that at least one accidental, possibly even unavoidable, death will occur. And if you're playing on hardcore, that's it. You're done. This is no roguelike, nor even roguelite. So it probably took you a lot more than an hour or 2 to get as far as you did before that death. So if that's the end of the story for that character, it can be utterly demoralizing for the player. A better solution for a game as long and as random as this one is medium core, as its punishment is not so utterly final. Alright, now I get to talk about something that is both another good reason to avoid hardcore, and the very thing I was reminiscing about when I decided to write the article, which then became this video. The excruciating, horrible, nerve-wracking occurrences that gave my medium core playthrough of Terraria sudden and unexpected interludes that were extremely fun. Picture this. You're scouting for resources underground and it's going well. You figure that you could head back and deposit your goods, but you've still got some space in your inventory. So, full of zeal, you venture deeper. Suddenly, you realize you've descended just a bit too far for your present capabilities, as a number of tough enemies are heading your way. But it's too late. Your character is overwhelmed and dies. Now what? If you're playing on softcore, you shrug, slurp up your drool, and put your things in a chest. If you're playing on hardcore, you clench your teeth and wallow in sadness for a bit. But if you're playing on medium core, now begins the utterly vital impromptu quest to reclaim your equipment from the depths of the world. Your dyes, your armor, your weapons, and your utilities are all down there, strewn across the rocks. It's eating you up just thinking about it. So you cobble together your second best armor, your second best weapons, and a recall potion. Your hard-forged recall item is also down in that hole, and you set about recovering what's yours. You have to be more stealthy and careful than usual, knowing that your stats are lower across the board during this recovery run. Failure here will just make it even harder to gather your goods again. Your Terraria headcanon will be firing at all cylinders during these runs. You will be your character, and you will be reciting Invictus in your head. And nothing quite compares to the feeling of contentment that comes when you are able to gather up your stuff, head home, and equip yourself back to the power level you had earned. The biggest fear of a medium core player is their character dying in a lava pit. If it happens in the early game, your items will be destroyed and you will be left with nothing. If it happens in the late game, such that almost all of your stuff is fireproof, then you're in for a particularly crazy recovery run, as you have to prepare some potions or strategic draining operations to get to the bottom of that pit. So, obviously, the least hospitable part of the map would be the part with the largest concentration of lava. And where might that be? Yep, you guessed it, it's Hell. Terraria's Hell is a wide yet narrow land of lava, with only sparse spires strewn through its caves to break up the flow. This hell is supposed to feel like the absolute worst extremity of the world, hence the name. It's meant to be aggressive, inconvenient, hot, and horrible. It's not supposed to just be an additional biome for you to harvest. It's the dungeon below the dungeon. All you softcore players with your early game Hellevators just don't understand the sharp gasp resulting from a medium core player even so much as nearing death in a pit of lava. Different areas of the map should be at varying levels of difficulty, and I do not mean that they should just require different amounts of time or resources. I mean that they should require different levels of vigilance and preparation. So, keep the hell in hell. Last, but certainly not least, there is the general strategy, reconnaissance, and base management that goes along with the medium core path through Terraria. These benefits, I fully admit, are also shared by the hardcore option. But hopefully you're not masochistic enough to disregard my earlier advice and try to beat the entire campaign on hardcore right away. In general, what you'll find yourself doing in medium core is playing carefully. Not out of fear, but out of prudence and a sense of self-made immersion. You want your raids and boss encounters to go well, so you'll scout well or prepare a proper arena. You want to fend off nightly threats and hard mode events, so you'll plan a secure and well-equipped base. You want to maximize your gather resources while minimizing your chance of death, so you'll do balanced decision-making about when to end an excursion. In short, you will inhabit your world. There is a general point here, which I alluded to earlier when discussing the game's level of tension, about how the consequences built into a game's failure states heavily determine the psychological experience of the player. Pacing, immersion, engagement, and all such key experiential attributes are matters of psychology. So when a game offers the player control over that aspect of the game, the onus is on the player to make a considered decision in order to yield the best possible experience. Summing all of the previous sections together, I, obviously, feel that such examination points in the direction of medium core. And when the final boss finally falls, you will know that it is because you are ready to defeat it. Not because every aspect of Terraria has become so trivial for you that you can beat it on hardcore, nor because you threw enough bodies at the world in softcore to force your way to the end. Yes, you will come through worn and bloodied, but as a result, you will also emerge feeling stalwart and triumphant. Here at the end of my list, I should rephrase and reiterate the caveat from the introduction. Terraria is such a mechanically broad game that there are many ways it can be played, and numerous genres into which it could arguably fall. For instance, one person might play the game solely to construct buildings, while another might play it solely to socialize with friends via multiplayer. The position of this video would probably be irrelevant to either of those players. Instead, the premise of this essay is directed at what I take to be the majority of players. those incrementally progressing through the game's boss sequence, and thus approaching the game essentially as an RPG with particularly deep systems. Even if I don't think Relogic is infallible, they did, after all, have a hand in publishing that game. I do think they're one of the most laudable game companies operating right now. Their continued support and improvement of the already wonderful game that is Terraria has turned it into one of the deepest crafting-based adventure games ever made. And if you take my medium core advice, I think you'll find your entire countless hours campaign in Terraria to be satisfying, engaging, and surprisingly immersive.